Miss Marple and the Wedding That Ended in Murder. Chapter 1. The Reception. The village of St. Mary Mead had been abuzz with wedding preparations for months. The union of Victoria Ashford, the vicar's daughter, to James Hartley, the promising young solicitor from London, was meant to be the social highlight of the season, the kind of event that would give the village something pleasant to discuss through the long winter months ahead. The reception was held at Ashford Hall, the vicar's substantial home on the outskirts of the village, with its manicured gardens now decorated with white ribbons and summer flowers. 300 guests milled about on the lawn, dressed in their finest champagne glasses, catching the afternoon light. The weather had cooperated beautifully. Even the clouds seemed to have postponed their arrival for this momentous occasion. Miss Jane Marple stood near the rose garden, a small cup of punch in her weathered hand, observing the proceedings with the quiet attention she had perfected over 70-some years. She wore a lavender dress, pearl earrings, and the expression of gentle interest, the kind that made people feel comfortable enough to forget she was watching them at all. Lovely affair, isn't it? Mrs. Wilson, the baker's wife, remarked, settling beside her with a satisfied sigh. Though I must say, I never thought Victoria would actually go through with it. Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. Why ever not, dear? Well, between you and me, Mrs. Wilson lowered her voice. There was that business with Mr. Hartley's previous engagement. To Margaret Winters, you know. Broke it off quite suddenly about 6 months ago. Some said he was running away from something, though nobody quite knew what. This was useful information, the kind that accumulated quietly in Miss Marple's mind like stones in a garden path. She made a soft sound of sympathy and continued observing. The bride looked radiant in white silk, her veil pinned with white roses. The groom appeared less certain, his smile flickering on and off like a light controlled by an uncertain hand. He kept glancing toward the house, where various family members moved about. Not far from them stood Richard Ashford, the vicar's brother, who worked in banking. He was speaking with unusual intensity to a woman. Miss Marple didn't immediately recognize a striking red head in an emerald dress. Their conversation seemed heated, conducted in low, urgent tones, despite their smiling faces. The art of pretense, Miss Marple noted, was practiced everywhere, even at celebrations. Isn't that Robert's cousin? Miss Marple asked Mrs. Wilson conversationally. The one from town. That's Sylvia Hartley, James's sister, Mrs. Wilson corrected. She came down from London just for the wedding. Rather mysterious woman, if you ask me. There's been talk about some scandal involving her and a business venture, but nobody knows the particulars. Miss Marple filed this away as well. The reception continued pleasantly enough through the afternoon. There was dancing on the terrace, a sumptuous meal served in the garden, and various toasts that were received with laughter and applause. The vicar gave a moving speech about his daughter's happiness. James's father, a stern-looking gentleman from Surrey, offered tepid congratulations, while keeping a watchful eye on his son. It was nearly 6 o'clock when the bride and groom excused themselves to change for their departure. They were to spend a few days in Cornwall before James returned to his law practice in London, and Victoria began her life as the wife of a solicitor. Miss Marple was standing on the terrace, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of amber and rose, when she noticed something odd. Richard Ashford had disappeared some 20 minutes earlier, but now he returned, moving quickly through the garden with an expression of poorly concealed anxiety. He spoke urgently to the vicar, gestured toward the house, and then both men hurried inside. A ripple of confusion began to spread through the gathered guests. People exchanged glances. Someone asked if everything was quite all right. The carefully orchestrated harmony of the celebration faltered. Like an orchestra losing its rhythm. 10 minutes later, the vicar emerged again, his face drained of colour. He went directly to the local constable, who had been enjoying a quiet cup of tea near the refreshment table, within the hour. The words everyone would remember had been spoken. James Hartley had been found dead in the library, slumped in the leather chair behind the desk, an empty brandy glass beside him. The young solicitor who had married that very morning was now the victim of what the constable initially believed was poisoning. The wedding reception dissolved into chaos, carefully managed by the village police. Guests were asked to remain while statements were taken. The happy occasion transformed into something sinister and incomprehensible, the kind of rupture in the ordinary world that reminded everyone how fragile their peace truly was. Miss Marple observed it all with her characteristic quietness. She watched how people reacted to the news. She noticed who seemed shocked and who seemed perhaps unsatisfied. She saw which guests moved toward the vicar's family in support and which created distance, creating a map of loyalty and suspicion through proximity alone. Young Victoria, still in her wedding dress, sat in the drawing room, her face a mask of shock that had not yet fully transformed into grief. James's sister, Sylvia, had gone very pale when the news reached her, and she had immediately closeted herself with James's father in a private room. Richard Ashford appeared agitated, moving restlessly from room to room, and Margaret Winters, the young woman James had broken his engagement with, had been found among the guests at the garden party. When told of her former fiancé's death, her reaction was peculiar. Her hand had trembled as she set down her glass, but her eyes, for just a moment, had shown something that might have been relief. As the evening deepened and the constable began his preliminary investigation, Miss Marple settled into a chair with her knitting, prepared to listen. She had learned long ago that in the aftermath of violence, people were most likely to speak truthfully, not because they intended to, but because they were too distracted by their own concerns to construct convincing lies. The murder of James Hartley had been committed by someone at that wedding reception. Miss Marple was quite certain of that, and she suspected that before the matter was resolved, the village would discover that the secrets lurking beneath St. Mary Mead's peaceful surface ran far deeper than anyone had imagined. For now, however, she knitted steadily and listened to the worried conversations around her, each word a thread in a pattern that would eventually reveal its true design. Chapter 2. The village reacts. By the following morning, St. Mary Mead had transformed into something resembling a beehive after it had been struck. The news of James Hartley's death had spread through the village with the inevitability of poison through water, each conversation adding new theories and interpretations until the facts themselves became almost secondary to the speculation. The constable had confirmed that poison was indeed the cause, a substance administered through the brandy decanter that sat on the library desk. The doctor, initially uncertain, had consulted with experts in the neighboring town, and by midday, the verdict was official. James Hartley had been murdered. Miss Marple sat in the post office, ostensibly purchasing stamps, while Mrs. Graves, the postmistress, conducted an energetic post-mortem of the previous day's events. It was obviously the new bride. Mrs. Graves declared with the certainty of someone who had never questioned her own conclusions. Cold feet, they call it. The girl realized she'd made a terrible mistake marrying a man she barely knew. So she poisoned him before the marriage could be consummated. Dreadful business, but there it is. How curious, Miss Marple said mildly, though one wonders how she managed it. Victoria was with her father nearly the entire afternoon, preparing to depart. Ah, but she could have poisoned the brandy earlier, Mrs. Graves countered, undeterred by logic. Before the reception began. Put something in the decanter and then waited for the opportunity. Miss Marple considered this. The brandy decanter was brought out only after the bride and groom went upstairs to change. I happened to notice the butler carrying it into the library at approximately 5:30. Rather an odd time for it, wouldn't you say? Before the celebration had truly ended. Mrs. Graves's expression faltered slightly, but she recovered quickly. Well, there's also the matter of that sister of his, Sylvia Hartley. A woman who dresses like that tall emeralds and red hair is bound to have questionable morals. Perhaps she did it. A family inheritance dispute, perhaps. She looked positively ghoulish when she heard the news. At the vicarage, Mrs. Helen Ashford, the vicar's wife, was receiving calls from concerned villagers. She sat in her parlour, a woman who had never been particularly strong, looking as though the events of the previous day had aged her considerably. Her daughter Victoria remained upstairs, sedated by the local physician. The police are investigating thoroughly, the vicar assured Mrs. Hartley. James's mother, who had come to pay her respects. They will discover the truth. Justice will prevail. But beneath his calm words, the vicar harboured his own secret anxiety. His brother Richard had behaved strangely the previous evening, and there was something about the intensity of Richard's conversation with Sylvia Hartley that nagged at his mind. Family loyalty, however, prevented him from mentioning it to anyone at the solicitor's office in town. James's business partner, Mr. Edmund Gray, was dealing with the practical aftermath of sudden death. Files needed organizing. Clients needed reassurance. A will needed to be located and read. In the midst of these mundane tasks, Mr. Gray found himself thinking rather a great deal about the money. James had been handling a rather significant property transaction for a local gentleman, a sale worth a considerable sum. The commission on such work was substantial, and with James dead, the question of whether the transaction would be completed, and whether the money would be paid, remained uncertain. Mr. Gray was not a sentimental man, and he found his thoughts drifting toward his own financial security with alarming frequency. At the cottage on Laurel Lane, Margaret Winters sat in her small garden, supposedly occupied with needlework, but actually staring at nothing. The breaking of her engagement to James 6 months ago had been the most painful experience of her young life. She had loved him genuinely, or believed she had. But he had ended things with an abruptness that suggested he was running from something rather than running towards something else. Now he was dead, and the manner of his death poisoning felt almost like a final cruelty. Whatever he had been fleeing, whatever secret he had harboured, it had caught up with him in the end. Margaret wondered, with the peculiar logic of the grieving, whether things might have been different if she had been more understanding, more patient, more willing to ignore the signs that something troubled him deeply. In the drawing room of Ashford Hall, Richard Ashford stood at the window, watching the village go about its business. His hands trembled slightly as he lit a cigarette. He had been present when the body was discovered, had, in fact, discovered it himself when he went to find James to discuss an urgent matter. The matter in question was one that Richard had hoped to resolve quietly, between family members. But now, with James dead and the police asking questions, Richard realized that his secret might soon be exposed. The thought made his stomach clench with something between fear and desperation. Miss Marple, having completed her postal business, made her way to the vicarage garden, where she knew the vicar often spent time in the afternoons, weather permitting. She found him sitting on a bench near the church wall, his face troubled. "A dreadful business," Miss Marple said, settling herself beside him with the ease of long acquaintance. "Though I confess, I find myself puzzled by certain aspects of it." The vicar looked at her wearily. "What aspects concern you, Miss Marple?" "The timing, primarily," she said thoughtfully. "The brandy was brought out quite late. If someone had intended to poison it, they would have had very little opportunity. The house was full of guests. Someone would have noticed." The vicar was quiet for a long moment. "You think the poisoning was done at the moment, then? Someone who was at the reception deliberately administered the poison?" "I think," Miss Marple said carefully, "that we ought to discover who had access to the library and when. And perhaps we might also consider why young James was in the library at all when he should have been celebrating with his new bride." The vicar's face paled slightly. "Richard found him. Richard went to speak with him about something. I have been meaning to ask my brother exactly what that something was." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her knitting needles clicking softly in the quiet garden. She had learned that the first confession, when it came, would likely not be the confession of the murderer. Someone in this village had much to hide, and fear had a way of loosening tongues. Even if those tongues spoke of the wrong sins, the question now was which secret would emerge first, and whether it would illuminate the path to the truth or merely obscure it further. Chapter 3. Early Investigation. Inspector Graves arrived from the county town on Thursday morning, accompanied by a sergeant and a demeanor that suggested he had investigated far more complicated crimes than the murder of a provincial solicitor. He was a methodical man in his 50s, with sharp eyes that seemed to catalogue everything they observed. The inspector set up his base of operations in the vicar's study, requesting that witnesses be brought to him in a steady stream. The vicar's housekeeper, Mrs. Potts, began the ungrateful task of ferrying people back and forth, each emerging from the study looking either relieved or deeply anxious. Miss Marple, having been at the reception and being known throughout the village for her discretion and sound judgment, was among those asked to provide her observations. She presented herself at the study door on Thursday afternoon, dressed impeccably in her usual style, carrying her knitting. Inspector Graves looked up from his notes with faint surprise. "I wasn't expecting you to bring your needlework, Miss Marple. I hope you don't mind," she said pleasantly, settling into the chair opposite him. I think more clearly when my hands are occupied. A habit of age, I'm afraid." The inspector gestured for her to continue. "Tell me about the events of Wednesday afternoon, from your perspective." Miss Marple began to recount the wedding reception with remarkable detail. She described the weather, the decorations, the arrangement of guests. She mentioned the toasts, the dancing, the timing of meals. She noted, with apparent casualness, the various conversations she had overheard. "I observed that Mr. Richard Ashford seemed rather preoccupied during the latter part of the afternoon," she said, her needles clicking steadily. "He and Miss Sylvia Hartley had what appeared to be an intense conversation near the refreshment table at approximately 4 o'clock. Later, he disappeared for some time before returning with visible anxiety." Inspector Graves made a note. "Did you hear what they discussed?" "Only fragments, I'm afraid. The music was rather loud. But Miss Hartley seemed to be remonstrating with Mr. Ashford about something he had not done." The word promised was mentioned more than once. And when did the brandy decanter appear? At 5:32, to be precise, Miss Marple said. I noticed because the church bell was striking the half hour as the butler carried it through the garden. Rather an odd time, as the reception was still in progress. Typically, brandy would be served after the guests had departed, or perhaps in the evening. Having it brought out mid-celebration seemed deliberate. The inspector leaned back in his chair. You have excellent powers of observation, Miss Marple. I've lived in St. Mary Mead for many years, she replied with a slight smile. One develops an eye for the disruptions to ordinary patterns. People and their routines are rather like the natural world when something is out of place. It stands out to those who are paying attention. After Miss Marple departed, Inspector Graves interviewed Richard Ashford. The banker was nervous, his collar too tight, his fingers fidgeting with his watch chain. I went to speak with James about a family matter, Richard said stiffly. Nothing to do with the reception directly. A business arrangement that required his legal attention. What sort of arrangement? The inspector pressed. Richard's jaw clenched. Private. A matter of inheritance and trusts. The details are not relevant to his death, but the inspector's instincts, honed over decades, detected the lie. Not necessarily a lie about the murder, but a lie about the importance of the matter. The inspector made another note and moved on to his next witness. Sylvia Hartley presented a different picture. She was composed, elegant, and cooperative, though something in her dark eyes suggested she was calculating every word before she spoke it. My conversation with Mr. Ashford was personal, she acknowledged. He had made me a promise regarding a business venture in London. A promise he had broken. I was disappointed, naturally, but hardly the kind of thing that would lead to murder. What was the nature of this venture? Inspector Graves asked. Sylvia smiled thinly. An investment opportunity. My brother James was to have been involved as well. It's a matter of family finances. Rather tedious, really. The inspector noticed that Sylvia's hands remained perfectly still as she spoke, the hands of a woman accustomed to maintaining control. Yet her pupils dilated slightly when she mentioned her brother, and a flush crept up her neck when she spoke of the broken promise. Margaret Winters, when interviewed, was honest to the point of self-incrimination. Yes, she had been engaged to James Hartley. Yes, he had ended the engagement suddenly. Yes, she had felt betrayed and heartbroken. Did you see Mr. Hartley at the reception yesterday? The inspector asked. I saw him from a distance, Margaret said quietly. We did not speak. I was surprised that he had invited me at all, given the circumstances. But I suppose it would have been more awkward to exclude me. And when did you last see him? During the ceremony itself. He looked pale, I thought, as though he hadn't slept well. But that's hardly unusual for a groom on his wedding day. Inspector Graves made a note about the groom's appearance. It suggested that whatever had motivated the murder might have been troubling. James Hartley, even before the poisoning occurred. Edmund Gray, the business partner, was remarkably forthcoming about the financial aspects of James's practice. Several significant transactions were pending. A property sale worth £5,000 was in its final stages. A trust was being established for a client whose identity Gray declined to reveal. Was Mr. Hartley troubled about any of these matters? The inspector asked. Gray considered the question. Not troubled, precisely. But he had seemed distracted in recent weeks. He made an error in a conveyance last month, quite unlike him. When I pointed it out, he became rather sharp with me. It was unusual behavior. By Friday afternoon, Inspector Graves had developed a preliminary list of suspects. Richard Ashford had opportunity and a motive he was hiding. Sylvia Hartley had been arguing with someone the morning of the murder and seemed to have financial desperation. Margaret Winters had a romantic grievance. Edmund Gray had potential financial gain from James's death if it affected the practice in some advantageous way. What the inspector still lacked was a clear mechanism and a clear motive that connected definitively to one person. It was at this juncture that Miss Marple, sitting in her cottage and reviewing her own observations with the thoroughness of a scholar, noticed something that would prove to be the crucial thread. The brandy decanter had been brought out at 5:32, she had noted, but the butler, when she had quietly inquired of him later, had mentioned that he had been instructed to bring it at 5 o'clock. Someone had prevented him from doing so until later, but who and why? That question, Miss Marple suspected, would reveal far more than the police had yet discovered. Chapter 4. The Obvious Suspect. By Saturday morning, the case had begun to crystallize around one figure with almost irresistible momentum. Inspector Graves, after consulting with his superiors and reviewing his notes, had become increasingly convinced that Richard Ashford was the culprit. The evidence, while circumstantial, was compelling. Richard had been in the house when the murder occurred. He had discovered the body, which was suspicious in itself. He had been in intense conversation with Sylvia Hartley about some financial matter he refused to discuss. He had disappeared for a significant period in the afternoon, and he had gone to the library specifically to find James, suggesting premeditation. When pressed further during a second interview, Richard had finally admitted that he and James had been discussing an investment in a property development scheme in London. Richard had invested heavily, perhaps too heavily, in the venture, and James had been approached to add his financial backing. But James refused. Richard said bitterly. He said the scheme was too risky, that he couldn't in good conscience recommend it to clients, and therefore couldn't invest his own money in it either. He said I had been reckless and foolish, and this angered you? The inspector asked. Of course it angered me. I had staked my reputation on bringing James into the project. I had promised the London investors that his involvement was certain. His refusal made me look like a fool. Enough of a fool to poison him. Richard went very pale. No, absolutely not. Yes, I was angry. Yes, I went to the library to discuss it further, to try once more to convince him. But he was alive when I left him. Perfectly alive. I have no idea who poisoned him. Yet despite Richard's denials, Inspector Graves began to build a case. He discovered that Richard's financial situation was precarious. The investment he had made was on the verge of collapse. If James had lived, Richard's humiliation would have been public and professional. With James dead, there was at least a possibility that the matter might be quietly buried, that the scandal could be contained within family circles. Moreover, Richard had access to the household. He knew the layout of the vicar. He might easily have arranged to delay the butler's delivery of the brandy, giving him time to poison it. On Saturday evening, Inspector Graves informed the vicar that he intended to make an arrest on Monday morning, pending final confirmation from the toxicologist regarding the poison. Word of the impending arrest spread through the village like wildfire. By Sunday morning, everyone knew that Richard Ashford would be charged with his nephew's murder. The scandal was a Mensa respected banker, a member of a prominent family, a murderer. Miss Marple, attending services at the church that Sunday, observed the vicar with particular attention. The man was haggard, aged by the knowledge that his own brother would soon be arrested. Victoria, pale and diminished, sat beside her mother, looking as though she might dissolve entirely. After the service, Miss Marple made her way to the vicarage, where she found the vicar in his study, staring out the window at the autumn garden. "A dreadful business," she said quietly, settling herself in the chair across from his desk. "My brother is innocent," the vicar said flatly. "Regardless of what the police believe, Richard did not murder James." "What makes you so certain?" Miss Marple asked gently. The vicar was quiet for a long moment. "Because I know my brother. Yes, he is ambitious. Yes, he is sometimes foolish with money. But he is not a murderer. And more than that." He paused, struggling with the weight of family loyalty. "Richard came to me on Wednesday evening, after the reception. He was distressed about the investment matter, but he was also relieved, in a strange way. He said that perhaps it was for the best, that James's refusal would force him to reconsider his entire approach to life. That does seem an unusual reaction from a man who had just learned his financial schemes were crumbling." Miss Marple observed. "Exactly. Which is why I believe him when he says he did not kill James." Miss Marple knitted thoughtfully for several moments. "Tell me, Vicar, did your brother mention anything else? Anything that seemed odd or out of place?" The vicar hesitated. "He said something quite strange. He asked me if I had noticed anything unusual about James's behavior in recent weeks. I told him I had not, as I had been occupied with wedding preparations. But Richard seemed almost relieved by that answer, as though he had been expecting something terrible. This was interesting. Very interesting indeed. And your daughter, Victoria," Miss Marple continued. "How did she seem on her wedding day? Before the tragedy, I mean. Nervous, naturally, but also distant, perhaps, as though her mind was elsewhere." I attributed it to wedding nerves, but now I wonder. Miss Marple rose to her feet, her knitting tucked under her arm. "I think, Vicar, that before the police make their arrest on Monday, there are certain facts that require clarification. Facts that may not have been brought to Inspector Graves's attention." "What facts?" the vicar asked desperately. "The question of who delayed the butler's delivery of the brandy," Miss Marple said. "I have been reflecting on that matter. The butler was quite clear that he was instructed to bring it at 5 o'clock, yet he did not do so until 5:32. Someone detained him. Someone who knew the poisoned brandy would be safe from discovery if it sat untouched for nearly half an hour." The vicar's eyes widened. I think," Miss Marple interrupted gently, "that Inspector Graves has made an assumption based on motive and opportunity without fully considering the question of preparation and access. Your brother may have had both motive and opportunity, but did he have access to the poison? And more importantly, did he have the knowledge to use it? These are questions the inspector has not adequately explored." As Miss Marple made her way home through the village streets, her mind was working through the various threads of the case, pulling them tight, examining them for inconsistencies. The obvious answer, Richard Ashford as the murderer, was almost too convenient. It was the kind of solution that satisfied the police because it allowed them to close the case and return to their regular duties. But Miss Marple had spent 70 years observing human nature, and she knew that the most obvious answer was often the one that someone had carefully arranged for the police to find. The real murderer, she suspected, was far more clever than that, and far more desperate. The arrest of Richard Ashford on Monday morning would not be the end of this case. It would merely be the moment when the true mystery began to unravel. Chapter 5. The Hidden Richard. Ashford was arrested on Monday morning with all the formality that small-town justice could muster. Inspector Graves arrived with a warrant, spoke quietly to the vicar, and then conducted Richard from the vicarage to the police van with professional courtesy. The village watched from behind lace curtains and garden gates, each observer convinced they had witnessed the moment justice was served. But Miss Marple was not satisfied. She spent Monday afternoon conducting what she termed her own informal inquiries, which involved visiting various members of the household and asking seemingly innocent questions about the wedding day's logistics. She called on Mrs. Potts, the vicar's housekeeper, and inquired about the arrangements for the reception. Such a complicated business. Managing so many guests, Miss Marple said, settling into the kitchen chair with her knitting. I imagine the staff was quite overwhelmed. Mrs. Potts, a woman in her 60s who had worked for the vicar for 30 years, was gratified by Miss Marple's interest. We were, indeed, Miss Marple. Young Thomas, the butler's assistant, was particularly frazzled. He spilled an entire tray of glasses in the afternoon, and the butler had to send him to the cellar to fetch replacements. How unfortunate, Miss Marple murmured. When did this accident occur? Do you remember? Around 4:30, I think. Or perhaps it was closer to 5. The afternoon was so hectic, you see. The bride was calling for assistance with her veil. The flowers needed rearranging, and the champagne wasn't properly chilled. And the butler, Miss Marple continued. Mr. Harrison, was he occupied with assisting young Thomas? Not entirely, but he was certainly distracted. The vicar had asked him to attend to some matter regarding the wine. And then there was the question of when to bring out the brandy decanter. The master wasn't entirely clear on the timing, you see. He kept changing his mind about when the brandy should be served. This was the crucial detail. Miss Marple's needles paused for just a moment. The vicar kept changing his mind. Yes, first he said 5 o'clock. Then he sent a message saying 5:30. Then he seemed uncertain again. The poor butler was quite confused about what time he should actually bring it out. Miss Marple resumed her knitting, her mind working rapidly behind her calm exterior. The vicar had been in control of the timing of the brandy delivery. The vicar had sent conflicting messages. The vicar, who was deeply devoted to his family, would have every reason to protect his brother if he believed Richard guilty, but that wasn't quite right either. If the vicar had been complicit in protecting Richard, he would have been consistent in his instructions, not contradictory. On Tuesday morning, Miss Marple called on Victoria at the vic. The young woman was in her room, dressed in black, her eyes hollow with shock and grief. My dear, Miss Marple said, settling herself on the edge of the bed. I wondered if you might help me understand something about the wedding day. I want to ensure that the truth comes out about what happened. Victoria looked at her with red-rimmed eyes. The police have already arrested Uncle Richard. Isn't that the truth? Perhaps, Miss Marple said carefully, but I'm not entirely convinced. Tell me, during those moments when you went upstairs to change your dress, the moment when James was supposedly in the library, did you see him at all? Victoria's hands trembled. No, he went to change in a separate room. That was the arrangement. The tradition, you understand. But you must have encountered someone in the hallway. The house was full of people that afternoon. Yes. I saw Sylvia, actually. James's sister. She was coming from the direction of the library, looking rather upset. Her dress was slightly disheveled, as though she had been in some sort of struggle. This was important information, and Miss Marple leaned forward. "Did she say anything to you?" She asked me where the brandy decanter was kept. I thought it was an odd question, but I was so focused on my own nervousness about the ceremony and the departure afterward that I didn't think much of it. I told her that I believed Mr. Harrison kept the fine brandy in the library cabinet. Miss Marple sat back, processing this revelation. Sylvia Hartley had been in the library. Sylvia had been near the brandy. Sylvia had seemingly been in distress. "Victoria," Miss Marple said gently, "did you notice anything unusual about James at the ceremony? Or earlier in the day?" The young woman's face crumpled. "He was nervous. I thought it was ordinary wedding nerves. But now I wonder. His hands were shaking when he put the ring on my finger, and he kept looking around as though he expected something dreadful to happen. I thought perhaps he was having doubts, and that made me feel ill. But you proceeded with the ceremony despite these concerns. What could I do? Everything was arranged. My family's reputation was at stake. The guests were assembled. One cannot simply cancel a wedding because a groom appears nervous." After leaving Victoria, Miss Marple made her way to the post office, where she knew Sylvia Hartley had taken rooms while awaiting the conclusion of the police investigation. She knocked on the door of the small sitting room where Sylvia had been permitted to remain. Sylvia opened the door, and Miss Marple observed her carefully. The younger woman was composed, but there was a brittleness to her composure, as though she might shatter if touched. "Miss Hartley," Miss Marple said, "I wonder if you might help me clarify something about Wednesday afternoon. I'm attempting to piece together the timeline of events, and I seem to have a confusion about when various people were in the library." Sylvia's pupils dilated slightly. "I don't know what you mean. I believe you were in the library at some point during the reception," Miss Marple continued pleasantly. "Victoria mentioned seeing you coming from that direction. You had asked about the location of the brandy decanter." For a long moment, Sylvia said nothing. Then, abruptly, she sat down heavily on the sofa. "Yes," she said quietly. "I was in the library. But not to poison James. I went to speak with him about the London investment. I was angry about the promises he had made, the promises he was about to break. We argued. He was adamant that he would not invest. I left in frustration. Was the brandy decanter in the library when you were there?" Miss Marple asked. "No, the cabinet was locked. I couldn't have accessed it even if I had wanted to." Miss Marple nodded slowly. This detail, the locked cabinet, would require verification, but it suggested that Sylvia, despite her presence in the library, could not have been the poisoner, which meant the poison had been administered by someone who had legitimate access to the brandy decanter, someone who knew it would be brought out at a specific time, someone who had the knowledge and the opportunity to introduce the poison without being observed. That someone, Miss Marple was increasingly certain, had not yet been adequately investigated by the police. Chapter 6. Confrontations and Secrets. Inspector Graves was not pleased when Miss Marple appeared at the police station on Wednesday morning with her observations about the locked cabinet and Sylvia Hartley's presence in the library. He was a man accustomed to having his theories confirmed, not questioned by an elderly woman with a knitting bag. "Miss Marple," he said with barely concealed impatience, "I appreciate your civic interest, but the case is quite clear. Mr. Ashford had motive, opportunity, and means. He was in the library at the critical time. He has been unable to provide a satisfactory explanation for his presence there." "But he has provided an explanation," Miss Marple countered gently. "He states he wished to discuss the investment matter further. That is hardly a secret or suspicious motive." People frequently revisit disagreements, hoping to reach compromise. He may say that now, but the facts suggest otherwise. Do they? Miss Marple tilted her head thoughtfully. Or do the facts merely suggest that someone wishes you to believe that? The brandy cabinet, Inspector, was locked. I have verified this with Mr. Harrison. He keeps the key on his person at all times. How, then, would Mr. Ashford have obtained the poison and administered it without the butler noticing? The inspector shifted uncomfortably. He could have obtained the poison earlier. Perhaps he carried it with him, but from where? Mr. Ashford has no known source for exotic poisons. His profession is banking, not chemistry. And more importantly, the poison was administered to the brandy, which was locked away. Unless Mr. Ashford had somehow secured the butler's key, which Mr. Harrison denies, the logistics of the crime become quite complicated. Inspector Graves's jaw tightened. I will speak with Mr. Harrison again about the key. But Miss Marple's visit had planted seeds of doubt. By Thursday morning, the inspector had begun to re-examine his assumptions. He interviewed the butler at length, questioning him about his movements, his access to the key, and any unusual requests made of him on Wednesday afternoon. It was during this interview that a new detail emerged. The butler admitted that on Wednesday, around 4 o'clock, the vicar had asked him to fetch something from the cellar, a specific vintage of wine for the evening reception. While the butler was below stairs, the vicar had been alone in the study. The key to the brandy cabinet hung on a hook near the study desk. How long were you absent? The inspector asked sharply. Perhaps 10 minutes, Inspector. No more than that. But 10 minutes would have been sufficient. 10 minutes to access the cabinet, to introduce the poison, to return the key and ensure everything appeared undisturbed. The inspector's eyes narrowed. Tell me, Mr. Harrison, did the vicar seem agitated when you returned? Now that you mention it, yes. He seemed rather preoccupied. He barely acknowledged my return. He simply repeated his instructions about the brandy timing and dismissed me. By Friday afternoon, Inspector Graves had a new theory forming in his mind, though it troubled him deeply. The vicar was a man of the cloth, respected throughout the parish. The notion that he might be involved in his own nephew's death seemed almost obscene. Yet the evidence, when examined through this new lens, began to point in a troubling direction. Miss Marple, meanwhile, continued her own investigations with the subtlety of someone selecting items at a village market. She visited the chemist in the neighboring town, inquiring casually about unusual purchases made in recent months. The chemist, Mr. Whitfield, was reluctant to violate customer confidentiality. But Miss Marple's gentle persistence and her reputation for discretion eventually loosened his tongue. There was one purchase that struck me as odd, he admitted. Some weeks ago, the vicar came in asking about substances that could be used for pest control, specifically for eliminating rats from the church cellar. I recommended a particular compound, quite effective, but quite poisonous as well. He purchased a small quantity. Did he seem concerned about the toxicity? Miss Marple asked. Not particularly. He simply nodded and said it was necessary. The church mice had been troublesome. Miss Marple thanked the chemist and returned to St. Mary Mead, her mind turning over the implications of this information. On Friday evening, she requested a private interview with the vicar. They sat in his study, the same room where the key to the brandy cabinet had hung so vulnerably, and Miss Marple began to speak with unusual directness. I believe you have been laboring under a terrible burden, she said quietly. a burden of family loyalty and conscience that has nearly led to the conviction of an innocent man. The vicar's face went ashen. "Miss Marple, I don't know what you purchased a poison some weeks ago, ostensibly for pest control," she continued. "You had access to the brandy cabinet key. You were in the library, alone, shortly before James died. Most tellingly, you seemed relieved after James was poisoned, not devastated as one might expect from an uncle losing a nephew." The vicar's hands gripped the arms of his chair so tightly his knuckles went white. "You are wrong. I did not poison James." "No," Miss Marple agreed. "But I believe you know who did. And I believe you have been protecting that person out of family loyalty, allowing the police to focus their suspicions on your brother instead." The vicar remained silent for a long moment. When he finally spoke, his voice was barely above a whisper. "If I tell you, you must promise that the truth will be handled with the utmost discretion. There are people who would be irreparably harmed by a public scandal." "I can make no such promise," Miss Marple said gently but firmly. "But I can promise that the truth, whatever it may be, is preferable to allowing an innocent man to be convicted of murder." The vicar rose and moved to the window, staring out at the darkening garden. James was not who everyone believed him to be. He was deeply in debt, far more deeply than anyone realized. His law practice was failing. He had made disastrous investments, following Richard's lead. The wedding was partly a matter of desperation, a hope that marrying well would provide him with financial stability. "And did it?" Miss Marple asked. "No, Victoria's family has modest means. The marriage would have changed nothing. But there was something else. James had discovered that someone had been embezzling money from the trust accounts he managed. Large sums that would have resulted in criminal charges if exposed." The vicar turned to face Miss Marple, and there were tears in his eyes. "He came to me 3 days before the wedding and confessed that he didn't know how to handle it. He said he needed to report it to the authorities, but that doing so would ruin not only his own life, but the lives of others. He was in anguish. Who was embezzling the money?" Miss Marple asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "His business partner," the vicar said heavily. "Edmund Gray. James had evidence. He was planning to go to the police after the honeymoon. But someone learned of his intention and decided to prevent that revelation." Chapter 7. Another twist. The revelation hung in the air of the study like smoke, shifting the entire landscape of the investigation. Miss Marple set down her knitting and regarded the vicar with steady compassion. "You said James came to you 3 days before the wedding," she said carefully. "Yet you allowed the wedding to proceed. You did not attempt to prevent it or warn Victoria." "I convinced myself that James would manage it," the vicar said bitterly. "I told him to report the matter after the honeymoon, to take a few days to think clearly. I was weak. I was afraid of scandal, of the impact on the church, on my own reputation. And now James is dead because I failed him." "No," Miss Marple said firmly. "James is dead because someone poisoned him, not because you failed to prevent the wedding. But tell me, did you suspect Edmund Gray immediately, or did you come to that conclusion through other means?" "I suspected him only after James died," the vicar admitted. "When the police began their investigation, I realized that Edmund Gray stood to benefit enormously from James's death. If James had gone to the authorities, Gray would have faced criminal charges, imprisonment, financial ruin. James's death ensured that the embezzlement would likely go undiscovered, at least in the short term. But you protected Richard instead of allowing the police to discover this connection, Miss Marple observed. Yes, I thought. I hoped that if I could somehow deflect attention, provide alternative suspects, the true criminal might slip away and the scandal might be contained. I was still thinking of protecting the family's reputation rather than seeking justice. Miss Marple rose and moved to stand beside the vicar at the window. Your intentions were understandable, if misguided. But we must now rectify this situation. Edmund Gray must be questioned properly about his whereabouts during the reception and about his knowledge of James's intentions regarding the embezzlement. The vicar nodded numbly. I will speak with Inspector Graves. Before you do, Miss Marple said, there is one more matter that troubles me. How did Edmund Gray obtain the poison? The chemist confirmed that you purchased it for pest control. Unless, she paused, her mind working through the implications. Unless you inadvertently provided him with access to it. Did you leave the poison where others might have found it? In your study, perhaps, or in the church? The vicar's face crumpled. I kept it in the church cellar, locked in a cupboard. But Richard has a key to that cupboard. He's the one who suggested I obtain the poison in the first place. He mentioned the mouse problem. And did you inform anyone else about the poison? I mentioned it to Edmund Gray when he came to call on Wednesday afternoon. He was visiting James at the vicarage, and I spoke with him briefly about various parish matters. I may have mentioned the pest control in passing. This was the thread that would unravel everything. Edmund Gray had known about the poison. Edmund Gray had motive the embezzlement James had discovered. Edmund Gray had opportunity. He was at the reception, likely mingling with the guests, but the mechanism remained unclear. How had Gray accessed the poison and introduced it to the brandy? Inspector Graves arrived at the vicarage late Friday evening, his expression grim. The vicar had called him immediately after Miss Marple's departure, and the inspector had come personally to take the new confession. Once the vicar had explained the embezzlement and his suspicions about Edmund Gray, Graves left to conduct a thorough search of Gray's residence in town. He returned Saturday morning with news that sent shockwaves through St. Mary Mead. Edmund Gray's house contained a detailed ledger documenting the embezzlement. Amounts ranging from £200 to £500 had been systematically removed from trust accounts over a period of 3 years. The total exceeded £8,000, a sum that would have destroyed Gray financially if discovered. More incriminating still, the police found a small quantity of the same poison that had killed James Hartley, hidden in a locked drawer in Gray's study desk. When confronted with this evidence, Edmund Gray initially maintained his innocence, but as the hours of interrogation wore on, his composure began to crack. By late Saturday evening, he confessed. I didn't plan to kill him, Gray said, his voice hollow. I only meant to frighten him, to convince him to keep silent. But when I learned that he intended to go to the authorities, I panicked. I obtained the poison from the vicar's supply. He had mentioned it when he visited, and I knew where he kept the key. I planned to introduce it to the brandy on the morning of the wedding. But there were too many people about, so you waited until the reception. Inspector Graves prompted. Yes, the brandy was to be served at 5 o'clock, the vicar said. I positioned myself near the library, waiting for the butler to bring the decanter in. But the butler didn't appear. There was some confusion about the timing. Finally, at 5:30, the butler came through with the decanter. He was distracted, hurrying. I had only a moment to slip the poison into a glass before James arrived to fetch the brandy. I had ensured that James would go to the library by sending him a note, supposedly from his solicitor colleague, requesting a private word about an urgent matter, and James drank the poisoned brandy immediately. I watched from the garden. He took a glass almost at once. Within minutes, he began to show signs of distress. Within an hour, he was dead. The confession was complete and damning. Edmund Gray was charged with James Hartley's murder, and within days, he was committed to trial. The impact on St. Mary Mead was profound. The scandal surrounding the embezzlement was nearly as shocking as the murder itself. Several prominent families realized that their own trust accounts had been compromised. The law firm would be dissolved. Its remaining clients transferred to other solicitors. Richard Ashford was released immediately. His reputation damaged, but his innocence established. He left St. Mary Mead within a week, departing for London with a sense of grim resignation about his own financial prospects. But there remained one loose thread that troubled Miss Marple. Even as Edmund Gray awaited trial, the poison in the glass, the poisoned glass that James had supposedly drunk from, had not actually been administered by Gray in the manner he described. The glass had been placed on the desk, but someone else had ensured that James drank from it specifically. Someone had orchestrated the poisoning with a precision that suggested careful planning and intimate knowledge of James's habits. Miss Marple sat in her cottage on Sunday afternoon, her knitting forgotten in her lap, contemplating the pieces of the puzzle that did not quite fit together. Edmund Gray had confessed, and his confession would likely satisfy the courts. But it was not. Miss Marple was increasingly certain. The complete truth, the real genius behind James Hartley's death, she suspected, had not yet been identified. And that person was likely someone far closer to the victim than Edmund Gray. Someone whose involvement would cause even greater devastation to the village if revealed. Chapter 8. Miss Marple's final tester. Confession of Edmund Gray should have brought closure to St. Mary Mead. Yet Miss Marple found herself unable to accept the tidy resolution that the police and the village seemed content to embrace. There were inconsistencies in Gray's accounts, more details that contradicted his own narrative, gaps in his explanation that suggested either deliberate deception or incomplete understanding. Most troubling was the matter of the specific glass. Gray claimed to have poisoned a glass that James would drink from, but the butler's testimony indicated that James had taken a glass from a tray that Gray could not have been certain James would select. And yet James had chosen precisely the poisoned glass, as though guided by some invisible hand. On Monday morning, Miss Marple paid a visit to Margaret Winters. The young woman was in her garden, deadheading roses with mechanical precision, as though the repetitive motion might somehow restore order to her disrupted world. Miss Winters, Miss Marple said, settling herself on a garden bench, I wonder if you might help me understand something about the reception. I've been puzzled by certain details, and I thought perhaps you might clarify them for me. Margaret set down her pruning shears. I'm not certain I can be of assistance, Miss Marple. I was rather withdrawn that day, observing from a distance. But you were present in the library at some point during the afternoon, were you not? Miss Marple asked gently. I saw you there, myself, near the bookshelves, apparently looking for a particular volume. Margaret's hands trembled slightly. Yes. I went in briefly. The reception was becoming overwhelming. I needed a moment of quiet. And did you encounter anyone in the library? Only briefly. Edmund Gray was in there for a few moments. He seemed agitated about something. He left almost Did you notice the cabinet or the decanter at any point? Margaret's face went very pale. Why are you asking me these questions? Because, Miss Marple said carefully, I believe you know more about what happened than you have told the police. Not because you are complicit in the murder, but because you are protecting someone you believe deserves protection. Margaret sank onto a bench, her shoulders sagging. For a long moment, she said nothing. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely audible. He came to me on Tuesday evening, 2 days before the wedding. James, I mean. He wanted to see me, to speak with me privately. He said he had made a terrible mistake, that he didn't love Victoria, that he had only agreed to the marriage because of financial pressures. He was desperate, Miss Marple. He begged me to run away with him, to give him another chance. And how did you respond? Miss Marple asked. I told him no. I told him that I had moved past my feelings for him, that he needed to face the consequences of his own choices. But that wasn't entirely true. Part of me still loved him, and part of me was angry at him for what he had done to me. For breaking our engagement without explanation. Miss Marple listened without interruption as Margaret continued her confession, though Margaret herself did not yet understand the full implications of what she was admitting. On Wednesday, at the reception, he tried to speak with me again. He pulled me aside near the refreshment table and said that after the wedding night, he would ask Victoria for an annulment. He said we could be together, after all, if I was willing to wait a few months. He was trying to convince me that everything would work out, that his marriage was merely a formality that could be undone. How did that make you feel? Miss Marple asked. Angry, so very angry. He had hurt me, and now he wanted me to wait in the wings while he played at being a husband. He wanted me to be complicit in deception. I told him I wanted nothing more to do with him, that he disgusted me. Margaret's hands clenched in her lap. Later, when the bride and groom went upstairs to change, I found myself in the library. I was trying to collect myself, to regain my composure. I saw the brandy cabinet, and I don't know what possessed me. I was so angry at him, at his selfishness, at his lies. I thought about how easy it would be to poison the brandy, to ensure that he could never hurt anyone else again. Did you attempt to do so? Miss Marple asked quietly. No, I opened the cabinet, but it was locked. I didn't have the key, and even if I had, I don't think I would have actually done it. The fantasy was enough, the thought that I could punish him for what he had done. Miss Marple regarded Margaret with compassion. But you saw someone else open that cabinet, didn't you? Someone who did have the key. Margaret's eyes filled with tears. Yes, I heard a footstep and turned to see someone unlocking the cabinet. I was shocked, frightened. I slipped out of the library through the garden door before they could see me. I didn't look back. I told myself I hadn't seen anything, that I must have imagined it. Who did you see, Miss Winters? Margaret shook her head. I don't know. I only saw the back of a figure in a dark suit. I thought perhaps it was one of the male guests, but I couldn't be certain. The library was dim, and I was so startled that I didn't look closely. This was the crucial moment. Miss Marple leaned forward, her voice gentle but insistent. Think carefully, Miss Winters. Was there anything distinctive about this figure? The way they moved, their height, their build? Margaret closed her eyes, clearly struggling to recall the fleeting image. They were slender, not very tall. They moved with purpose, as though they knew exactly what they intended to do. And there was something else, a glimpse of a cufflink, gold, with what looked like an initial engraved on it. A gold cufflink with an initial. Miss Marple's mind immediately began to catalogue the men present at the reception who might have worn such jewellery. Richard Ashford had gold cufflinks, but she had seen him wearing them. They bore the letter A for Ashford. The vicar wore simple silver cuffs. Edmund Gray's jewellery was modest and unremarkable, but there was one person she had not yet fully considered. Someone whose movements and motives had been overshadowed by the arrest of Edmund Gray. "Miss Winters," Miss Marple said, rising to her feet, "I want you to know that what you have told me will likely remain between us. You are not complicit in any crime, only in human weakness and anger. But there is someone else who must be confronted with the truth of what occurred in that library. That someone," Miss Marple was now quite certain, was Sylvia Hartley. Over the next 2 days, Miss Marple set about confirming her hypothesis. She requested to examine the cufflinks worn by various members of the household. The vicar, when she inquired delicately, mentioned that his brother Richard had given him a pair of gold cufflinks years ago, bearing the initial A. The vicar's wife admitted that she often borrowed her husband's cuff when her own jewellery needed cleaning. But it was the mention of Sylvia Hartley that provided the final confirmation Miss Marple required. The young woman, it transpired, wore men's jewellery, occasionally a habit from her time in London, where she had adopted various unconventional practices. Among her belongings, in a small leather case, were a pair of gold cufflinks engraved with the initial H for Hartley. On Wednesday afternoon, Miss Marple arranged a meeting with Sylvia at the tea room in the village. They sat at a corner table, away from other patrons, and Miss Marple began her careful interrogation with deliberate indirectness. "I have been reflecting on the family dynamics," Miss Marple said, pouring tea with steady hands. "Families are such complicated arrangements, are they not? So many unspoken obligations and resentments that accumulate over years." Sylvia watched her warily. "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" "I am suggesting nothing. I am merely observing that your brother James was deeply troubled in the days before his death. Troubled by financial difficulties, by moral conflicts, by the pressure of maintaining appearances while his inner world was collapsing. James was always prone to anxiety," Sylvia said carefully. "And you, Miss Hartley," Miss Marple continued, "were equally troubled by your own financial situation. Your business venture in London was failing. You needed money, which is why you came to James requesting assistance. Yet he refused you, just as he refused your Uncle Richard." Sylvia's jaw tightened. "I don't see how my personal troubles are relevant to the murder investigation." "They are relevant," Miss Marple said gently, "because they provide motive. Not for murdering your brother. No, you did not intend that, but for something else. You intended to retrieve something that belonged to you, something that your brother had obtained through questionable means." For the first time, Sylvia's composure cracked. A flush crept up her neck, and her fingers gripped the teacup so tightly that Miss Marple was afraid it might shatter. "The letters," Sylvia said hoarsely. "He had letters that could have destroyed my reputation, my chances of finding respectable employment. Letters written to a woman I was intimate with in London. James had discovered them among my belongings when he visited and threatened to expose them if I did not agree to repay a loan he had made me. So on Wednesday, you went to the library to retrieve these letters," Miss Marple said. "You used your knowledge of your brother's habits to unlock the cabinet where he kept important documents. You were searching for the letters when you discovered the brandy." "I was furious," Sylvia said, her voice trembling with emotion long suppressed. "I had already endured so much from my brother, his judgment, his condescension, his blackmail. And there, sitting in his library, was the means to finally silence him, to finally make him understand the consequences of his cruelty. "But you did not administer the poison yourself," Miss Marple said. "Edmund Gray had already done that. You were simply too late to prevent what was already in motion." Sylvia's face went ashen as the realization struck her. Gray poisoned him. James was already dying before I even opened the cabinet. Yes, Edmund Gray feared exposure regarding the embezzlement. But by the time you accessed the library, the poison was already in the glass, waiting only for James to drink it. You may have opened the cabinet intending to murder your brother, but you were not his murderer. Edmund Gray was... Chapter 9. Revealed the confession of Sylvia Hartley's intentions, though not her actions as a murderer, created a secondary scandal that rippled through St. Mary Mead with almost as much force as the original murder. The revelation that she had sought to poison her own brother, or would have. Had Edmund Gray not beaten her to it cast the entire case in a new and deeply unsettling light. Yet, Miss Marple understood that Sylvia's confession, while morally significant, was legally irrelevant. The young woman had committed no crime that the law could prosecute. She had not administered the poison. She had not intended James's death in the manner that had actually occurred. She was, in the eyes of the court, innocent of murder, though guilty of contemplating it. The greater revelation, however, was what Sylvia's presence in the library confirmed about Edmund Gray's account. Gray had lied, or, at least, had been significantly less than truthful about the critical moments of the poisoning. Inspector Graves, when Miss Marple presented her findings, was initially dismissive. "The case is closed," he said flatly. "Gray has confessed. He will stand trial. The matter is resolved." "But it is not resolved," Miss Marple insisted gently. "Mr. Gray's confession contains significant inaccuracies. He claims to have poisoned a glass that James would select, but the mechanism by which James would select that particular glass remains unclear. Moreover, Gray's account of his movements during the critical period does not align with the testimony of other witnesses." "What are you suggesting, Miss Marple?" the inspector asked wearily. "I am suggesting that while Edmund Gray may have introduced the poison to the brandy decanter or to a glass, he did not orchestrate James's consumption of it. Someone else ensured that James drank from the poisoned glass. Someone who had intimate knowledge of James's habits and preferences." Inspector Graves leaned back in his chair. Despite his initial resistance, he was beginning to see the merit in Miss Marple's reasoning. "Who, then?" "I believe," Miss Marple said carefully, "that you should re-examine your interviews with the household staff, particularly the butler and the vicar's wife. One of them may have information they did not initially realize was significant. The re-examination revealed a crucial detail that had been overlooked in the initial investigation. The butler's assistant, young Thomas, had been instructed by Mrs. Helen Ashford, the vicar's wife, to bring a specific glass to James when he went to the library. Mrs. Ashford had selected this glass from the cabinet and given it to Thomas with explicit instructions. "Give this to Mr. Hartley when he arrives. Tell him it is a special vintage the vicar wished him to taste." When questioned about this detail, Mrs. Ashford initially denied it. But when confronted with Thomas's corroborating testimony, she broke down entirely. "I knew," she said through tears. "I knew that James had discovered the embezzlement, and I knew that he intended to go to the authorities. Edmund Gray came to me in desperation, begging me to help him prevent the scandal. He said it would ruin everything: the law firm, our reputation, Richard's prospects. He told me he had obtained the poison and would administer it somehow, but he needed my help to ensure that James would actually consume it. And you agreed?" Inspector Graves asked, his voice heavy with disappointment. I didn't think he was serious," Mrs. Ashford said, though her voice suggested she did not believe her own denial. "I thought it was merely talk, a fantasy of desperation. But when he pressed me, when he explained the consequences of James's revelations, I found myself weakening. I told him I would ensure James drank from a specific glass. I don't know what I thought. It was all so confused and terrible." The vicar, listening to his wife's confession from across the room, looked as though the ground beneath him had collapsed. His face went grey, and he gripped the mantelpiece for support. "Helen," he said, his voice hollow, "what have you done?" "I am complicit in your nephew's death," she said, her words falling like stones. "Not through my own hand, but through my cooperation with Edmund Gray. I ensured that James drank the poisoned brandy. Without my involvement, Edmund Gray's plan would likely have failed. With this revelation, the case transformed entirely. Edmund Gray was not merely a desperate embezzler attempting to cover his crime. He was a man who had found an unwilling but effective accomplice in Mrs. Ashford, the vicar's wife. A woman who had placed the preservation of her family's reputation above the life of her husband's nephew, Miss Marple. Sitting quietly in the police station as these confessions unfolded, felt the weight of human weakness and moral compromise settle heavily upon her. She had, through her persistence and careful observation, uncovered not one murderer, but two conspirators whose combined actions had resulted in James Hartley's death. On Friday morning, Miss Marple requested a final interview with Inspector Graves. She came prepared with her conclusions, delivered with the clarity that came from 70 years of observing human nature. "The murder of James Hartley," she said, "was not the work of a single individual driven by a single motive. Rather, it was the convergence of multiple despairs. Edmund Gray despaired of his financial ruin. Mrs. Ashford despaired of her family's scandal. Both were willing to commit murder to prevent the consequences they feared. But why did Mrs. Ashford agree to participate?" the inspector asked. "Because," Miss Marple said thoughtfully, "she had been conditioned to prioritize family reputation above all else. She had spent 30 years as the wife of a vicar, learning to suppress her own desires and perspectives in favor of maintaining appearances and protecting the churches, standing in the community. When Edmund Gray appealed to her as a member of that same community, when he framed the murder not as killing but as preserving, she found her resistance eroded. She believed herself to be acting in her family's best interest. That hardly excuses her crime," the inspector said. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "It merely explains it. And understanding is not the same as excusing." The case was now ready for trial. Both Edmund Gray and Helen Ashford would face charges of murder. The vicar, though not directly complicit, would face the anguish of knowing that his wife had betrayed him and their God in the most fundamental way. Victoria Hartley, having lost her husband on her wedding day, would now learn that her mother had played a role in his death. St. Mary Mead would endure this. Scandal with the resilience of small villages, everywhere with gossip and judgment, and the gradual forgetting that time brings. But the village would never be quite the same. The perfect facade of peaceful respectability had been shattered, revealing the darkness that lurked beneath. Miss Marple, her knitting completed, her observations recorded, returned to her cottage to contemplate the lessons this case had taught her about the infinite capacity of ordinary cruelty. people to commit extraordinary cruelty when motivated by fear and pride. Chapter 10. Aftermath. The trial of Edmund Gray and Helen Ashford concluded on a grey November afternoon, exactly 3 months after the wedding that had ended in murder. The verdict was guilty for both defendants. Edmund Gray received a sentence of life imprisonment for his role in administering the poison. Helen Ashford, her culpability deemed somewhat less direct, though her moral complicity undeniable, received 15 years. The courtroom had been packed throughout the proceedings, with residents of St. Mary Mead sitting in the gallery, their faces reflecting the uncomfortable knowledge that one of their own, a woman they had known and respected, had chosen murder as a solution to her anxieties about reputation. The vicar sat in the front row throughout the trial, his posture increasingly bent under the weight of his wife's betrayal. His faith, once the steady foundation of his existence, now seemed fragile and insufficient to explain or forgive the darkness that had emerged from within his own household. Victoria Hartley did not attend the trial. She had withdrawn from St. Mary Mead entirely, moving to stay with distant relatives in Cornwall. Some said she would eventually remarry, that life would eventually move forward. Others suspected that the shock of her husband's death, combined with the revelation of her mother's involvement, had fundamentally altered something in her spirit that no amount of time could repair. Richard Ashford. His name cleared, but his financial circumstances considerably diminished by the failed investments and the scandal that had attached itself to his family, had relocated to Manchester, where he could begin again without the suffocating weight of village gossip and familial association. Sylvia Hartley faced no criminal charges for her aborted attempt to access the library cabinet and retrieve the letters. However, her reputation in London was effectively destroyed by the revelations about her personal relationships and her intentions toward her brother. She departed England entirely, accepting a position as a companion to a wealthy widow in Paris, where she hoped to rebuild some semblance of a respectable life. Margaret Winters found unexpected salvation in the aftermath. Having nearly poisoned James out of anger and betrayal, she came to understand the depths of her own capacity for darkness. This knowledge, paradoxically, liberated her. She began attending meetings of a charitable organization in the neighboring town, dedicating herself to work with young women in difficult circumstances. The guilt she carried became, in its way, a form of redemption. By December, St. Mary Mead had begun the slow process of returning to its ordinary rhythms. The scandal, while not forgotten, had begun to settle into the historical fabric of the village, the kind of dramatic story that would be retold and embellished for decades, becoming part of the villagers' collective mythology. Miss Marple sat in her sitting room on a cold December afternoon, a cup of tea cooling beside her as she reflected on the case. Inspector Graves had visited her the previous week to thank her for her assistance, though his gratitude carried an undertone of resentment that she had been correct where his initial theories had been incomplete. The question that lingered in Miss Marple's mind was not one of fact but of philosophy. What had led to ostensibly respectable people to commit murder? Edmund Gray had been motivated by the fear of exposure and financial ruin. But Helen Ashford Watt had driven a woman of faith and propriety to assist in ending a human life. The answer, Miss Marple concluded, lay in the insidious nature of reputation and the ways it could corrupt even the most virtuous intentions. Helen Ashford had been so thoroughly conditioned to prioritize the appearance of respectability that when confronted with a choice between truth and family honor, She had chosen honor, and in making that choice, she had betrayed everything that true honor actually meant. It was a lesson that Miss Marple had learned many times over the course of her life. Yet it never ceased to sadden her the observation that the pursuit of a respectable facade could lead people to commit the most disreputable acts. The vicar came to visit her on the 23rd of December, 2 days before Christmas. He was a diminished figure, aged considerably by recent events, his clerical collar seeming to hang loosely on a frame that had lost both weight and presence. "I wanted to thank you," he said, settling into the chair opposite hers, "for ensuring that the truth came to light. However painful that truth has been, I merely observed and made inquiries," Miss Marple said gently. "The truth revealed itself through the actions and words of those involved. Helen is unwell," the vicar continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "The prison authorities write that she has deteriorated significantly. The realization of what she has done, the magnitude of her crime against my nephew and against God, has broken something within her." "I am sorry to hear it," Miss Marple said, and she meant it genuinely. She harbored no pleasure in the suffering of others, even those who had committed terrible acts. "I have been reflecting on the nature of forgiveness," the vicar said. "As a man of the cloth, I am supposed to believe in the redemptive power of repentance, and yet I find myself unable to forgive my wife for what she has done. I cannot bring myself to visit her, to offer her the comfort that my faith teaches I should provide." "Forgiveness is a difficult grace," Miss Marple said carefully. "It requires not merely the acceptance of an apology, but the genuine transformation of one's own heart. You cannot force such transformation through duty alone. It must come, if it comes at all, through the slow work of time and prayer." The vicar nodded slowly, seeming to take some comfort in this acknowledgement that forgiveness need not be immediate or easy. After he departed, Miss Marple returned to her knitting, the needles clicking in the familiar rhythm that had accompanied her through decades of observation and reflection. The case of James Hartley's murder was closed, the legal machinery having ground through to its conclusion. But the human tragedy that underlay the case would continue to unfold long after the public attention had moved on to other matters. This was the reality that Miss Marple had come to accept over her many years. Justice, as administered by courts and constables, was a necessary but ultimately incomplete response to human wrongdoing. True justice would require transformation of the hearts and spirits of those involved, a transformation that no legal sentence could compel. She thought of James, dead at his own wedding, his life cut short by the convergence of others' despairs. She thought of Victoria, robbed of her marriage and her future. She thought of the vicar, whose faith had been tested beyond measure. She thought of Edmund Gray and Helen Ashford, both now imprisoned not merely by walls and bars, but by the consciousness of their own actions. And she thought of Margaret Winters and Sylvia Hartley, both having glimpsed the capacity for darkness within themselves and having been forced to reckon with that knowledge in ways that might eventually lead to some form of redemption. The village of St. Mary Mead would endure. It would heal after a fashion. Life would continue as life always did, with its mixture of joy and sorrow, virtue and vice, kindness and cruelty. And Miss Marple would remain, observing it all with her quiet wisdom, understanding that the patterns of human nature repeated themselves endlessly, each generation discovering anew the same truths that previous generations had learned and forgotten. She picked up her knitting with steady hands and continued her work, content in the knowledge that she had done what she could to bring truth to light. leaving the more complex work of redemption and healing to others, who might prove more equal to the task. The winter evening deepened outside her window, and the village lights began to glow in the gathering darkness, a constellation of human habitation, each light representing a household with its own secrets, its own struggles, its own capacity for both good and evil. Such was the nature of human society, Miss Marple reflected, and such was the reason that her observations would never cease to be necessary. Chapter 11. Whispers and Revelations. The new year arrived in St. Mary Mead with a peculiar atmosphere, one of outward normalcy masking deeper currents of unease. The village had learned a difficult lesson about the gap between appearances and reality, yet most of its residents seemed determined to rebuild the facade as quickly as possible, as though by returning to ordinary routines they might restore the innocence they had lost. It was in early January, during a particularly cold spell that had frozen the village lanes into treacherous sheets of ice, that Miss Marple began to notice something troubling in the whispered conversations that occurred at the post office, the church, and the village market. New rumors had begun to circulate. Rumors concerning James Hartley's financial affairs and the nature of the embezzlement that Edmund Gray had supposedly conducted. According to these whispers, the sum involved was considerably larger than anyone had initially acknowledged. Moreover, there were suggestions that James himself had been involved in the embezzlement, not merely as a victim, but as a willing participant. Miss Marple first heard these rumors from Mrs. Wilson, the baker's wife, who had acquired them through the traditional channels of village gossip. "They're saying," Mrs. Wilson confided, lowering her voice conspiratorially, "that James and Edmund Gray were in cahoots from the beginning, that they were systematically stealing from the trust accounts together. The question is whether James's death was truly murder or whether it was something far more calculated, a way for Edmund Gray to eliminate his partner and claim all the stolen money for himself." "How curious," Miss Marple murmured, though her mind was immediately alert to this new development. Yet that theory would contradict the evidence presented at trial. Ah, but would it? Mrs. Wilson's eyes gleamed with the satisfaction of one who possessed information others did not. "I happen to know, through my cousin who works in the solicitor's office in town, that there were documents found among James's personal effects documents that were never mentioned during the trial. They suggested that James had been making withdrawals of his own, deposits that didn't align with his legitimate legal work. This information, if accurate, changed the complexion of the case considerably." Miss Marple thanked Mrs. Wilson for her candor and made her way home, her mind working through the implications of this new complication. That evening, she wrote a letter to Inspector Graves, requesting a meeting to discuss certain matters that she believed warranted further investigation. The inspector, though somewhat reluctant, agreed to see her when they met in his office the following day. Miss Marple was direct in her inquiry. "Is it true," she asked, "that documents were discovered among James Hartley's personal effects that suggested his own involvement in the embezzlement?" Inspector Graves's expression darkened. "Where did you hear that?" "Through the ordinary channels of village gossip," Miss Marple replied. "But the question of whether the information is accurate remains. And if it is accurate, I wonder whether the trial adequately addressed the possibility that James Hartley was himself a criminal, not merely a victim." The inspector was silent for a long moment, then rose and retrieved a file from a locked drawer in his desk. He withdrew several documents and spread them before Miss Marple. "We found these," he said quietly, "in a concealed compartment in James's desk at home. They are records of withdrawals made by James over a period of 6 months. Withdrawals that total approximately £3,000. We could not definitively determine whether these withdrawals were legitimate transfers on behalf of clients or whether they represented stolen funds. Miss Marple examined the documents carefully, noting the dates, the amounts, the account numbers. A pattern began to emerge, one that suggested James had indeed been involved in a sophisticated scheme to divert client funds. Why, she asked, looking up at the inspector, were these documents not presented at trial? Because, the inspector said heavily, the Crown's legal team determined that introducing them would complicate the case, without fundamentally altering the verdict. Edmund Gray admitted to poisoning James. Helen Ashford admitted to her role in ensuring that James consumed the poison. The fact that James himself may have been engaged in embezzlement was deemed irrelevant to the question of who murdered him. But it is highly relevant, Miss Marple said, to the question of why he was murdered. If James and Edmund Gray were partners in crime, then the murder takes on an entirely different character. It becomes not a murder motivated by one man's fear of exposure, but potentially a murder motivated by a falling out between thieves. Inspector Graves nodded grimly. We considered that possibility. However, Gray's confession remained consistent. He claimed he acted alone to prevent James from exposing his theft. There was no evidence that he knew James was also stealing. Did you ask him directly whether he knew? Miss Marple pressed. We did. He denied any knowledge. He insisted that he believed James was honest, that James's intention to go to the authorities was based on James's discovery of Gray's theft, not on mutual guilt. Miss Marple set down the documents and regarded the inspector thoughtfully. And do you believe him? I did, the inspector admitted. But your question has prompted me to reconsider. It is entirely possible that Gray was lying about his knowledge of James's involvement. It is possible that the murder was precipitated not by fear of exposure alone, but by some conflict between the two men regarding the division of the stolen funds. Precisely, Miss Marple said, which raises an uncomfortable question. If Edmund Gray knew that James was also a thief, would that not have changed the moral calculus of his decision to poison him? Would not the necessity of murder seem somewhat less pressing if both men were criminals? Are you suggesting that Gray might not have murdered James at all? The inspector asked, clearly troubled by the implications. I am suggesting, Miss Marple said carefully, that the evidence presented at trial may have been incomplete, that the case, while resolved in a legal sense, may not have achieved genuine justice if the true nature of the crime has not been adequately explored. The inspector left the meeting in a state of considerable agitation. Inspector Graves was not a man who relished the prospect of reopening a case that had been officially concluded. Yet Miss Marple's observations had planted doubts that he could not easily dismiss. Over the following week, Miss Marple conducted her own investigation into the financial records that had been discovered. She requested access to the documents and spent several evenings carefully analyzing the transactions, noting patterns and inconsistencies. What emerged was a picture, considerably more complex than either the trial had suggested or the police had initially understood. James and Edmund Gray had indeed been partners in theft, though the nature of their partnership remained unclear. Some transactions appeared to have been conducted by Gray alone, others by James alone, and still others seemed to have involved both men. Moreover, there were gaps in the record's periods of several weeks, during which no transactions occurred, followed by periods of intense activity. These gaps suggested either that one or both men had been afraid to continue their theft, or that they had temporarily suspended their criminal activity for reasons unknown. The most significant discovery came when Miss Marple examined the dates of the transactions in relation to the dates of James's broken engagement with Margaret Winters. James's solo thefts had begun approximately 2 months after his engagement to Margaret had been broken. Moreover, the amounts he had stolen increased substantially in the weeks immediately preceding his engagement to Victoria. The pattern suggested that James had been desperately seeking funds that he had needed for some purpose related to his romantic entanglements. Miss Marple's conclusions crystallized into a theory that was both more charitable and more damning than the official narrative. James Hartley had not been a hardened criminal, but rather a desperate man who had stumbled into criminality through circumstance. His involvement in the embezzlement had likely begun as an attempt to solve some immediate financial problem perhaps a debt incurred through his romantic difficulties, perhaps a personal crisis that required funds he did not possess. Edmund Gray, recognizing James's desperation and his knowledge of financial systems, had recruited him as a partner in theft. But as their criminal partnership had deepened, something had shifted. Either James had developed a conscience, or he had become frightened of the consequences, or he had simply decided that the risk was no longer worth the reward. His decision to go to the authorities, whether that decision was motivated by genuine moral awakening or by fear of exposure, had triggered Edmund Gray's violent response. Yet here was the complication. If James had been planning to expose not only Gray's theft, but also his own involvement in the embezzlement, then Gray would have understood that James's confession would result in criminal charges against both of them. Under those circumstances, would not Gray's fear of exposure have been at least equally pressing? And would not the murder, in that context, have represented not a crime of desperation, but something far more calculated? Miss Marple brought these conclusions to the vicar, believing that he deserved to understand the true nature of his nephew's character and choices. The vicar listened in silence as she explained her findings, his face growing increasingly troubled. "You are telling me," he said slowly, "that James was not the innocent victim I had believed him to be, that he was himself engaged in theft and corruption." "I am suggesting," Miss Marple said gently, "that James was a complex human being who made terrible choices, but who also, perhaps, attempted to rectify those choices in the end. His death does not become less tragic because he was flawed. It merely becomes more complicated to understand." The vicar rose and moved to the window, staring out at the frozen garden. "Does this information change anything about the case? Will it affect Helen's sentence?" "I do not believe so," Miss Marple said. "The law, as it functions in this country, is concerned with establishing who committed the act of murder, not with rendering a comprehensive judgment on the moral character of all parties involved. Edmund Gray murdered James Hartley. Helen Ashford assisted in that murder. The fact that James himself was engaged in criminal activity does not excuse or diminish those actions, yet it complicates our understanding of them," the vicar said heavily. "It suggests that the world is far more morally ambiguous than we would prefer to believe." "Yes," Miss Marple agreed. "That is precisely what it suggests. And that is a lesson that the village has been forced to learn, whether it wished to or not." Chapter 12. Resolution and Reflection by late February. As winter began its reluctant retreat and the first tentative signs of spring appeared in the village, the case of James Hartley's murder had finally, truly, settled into the past. The legal proceedings were concluded. The sentences had been handed down. The appeals process had begun, but would ultimately change nothing of consequence. Miss Marple received a letter from Inspector Graves informing her that additional inquiries into James Hartley's financial activities had been completed. The evidence of his involvement in the embezzlement was conclusive, but as Miss Marple had predicted, it altered nothing about the trial's outcome or the sentences imposed. Justice, as society understood it, had been served. Yet Miss Marple found herself contemplating a different sort of justice, one that operated not through courts and constables, but through the natural consequences of human choices. James Hartley, whatever his intentions regarding confession and redemption might have been, would never have the opportunity to make those choices now. His death had suspended him eternally in a state of moral ambiguity, neither fully redeemed nor fully condemned, a figure whose true nature and ultimate trajectory would remain forever unknown. It was on a Wednesday afternoon in late February that Margaret Winters called upon Miss Marple. The young woman had begun to establish herself in her charitable work, and there was about her a quality of purposeful engagement that had not been present during the months following James's death. "I wanted to thank you," Margaret said, settling herself in Miss Marple's sitting room with the ease of one who had been made welcome, "for your discretion regarding my confession about the library. No one in the village knows that I contemplated poisoning James. That knowledge remains between us." "As it should," Miss Marple replied. "Your intention, though dark, was never acted upon. The thought of a crime is not the same as the commission of it, though it is a lesson many people learn only through suffering. I have been reflecting a great deal on what I learned about myself that day," Margaret continued. "I discovered that I was capable of murder. That knowledge is both terrible and, in an unexpected way, liberating. It has stripped away any illusions I harbored about my own virtue." "And how has that realization affected your work with the charitable organization?" Miss Marple asked. "It has made me far more effective," Margaret said thoughtfully. "I no longer approach the young women I work with from a position of superiority, as though I was some paragon of virtue instructing the fallen. Instead, I approach them as a woman who understands the capacity for darkness within herself and therefore can extend genuine compassion to others who have succumbed to theirs." Miss Marple nodded with approval. "That is wisdom hard-earned and doubly valuable for its difficulty." After Margaret's departure, Miss Marple sat alone with her knitting, reflecting on the intricate ways that trauma and tragedy could reshape human character. Some people, like Margaret, were hardened by adversity into sharper, clearer versions of themselves. Others, like the vicar, were diminished by it, their confidence in both themselves and their faith eroded by circumstances beyond their control. The question of what constituted genuine justice remained unresolved in Miss Marple's mind. Edmund Gray had been imprisoned for a murder he had committed, yet his crime had been motivated by self-preservation rather than malice. Helen Ashford, a woman of faith and propriety, had assisted in that murder out of a distorted sense of family loyalty. James Hartley, though murdered, had been engaged in his own criminal enterprises, and Margaret Winters, who had contemplated murder, remained free and was actually building a meaningful life through her charitable work. Where was the justice in such arrangements? Miss Marple had spent 70 years observing human nature, and she had come to understand that justice, as traditionally conceived punishment proportional to crime, virtue rewarded, vice punished, was largely a fiction. Reality was far messier, far more complicated, and far less satisfying to our desire for order and moral clarity. In early March, Miss Marple received a visitor who surprised her greatly. Sylvia Hartley, having spent several weeks in Paris, had returned to England briefly to settle certain matters relating to her brother's estate and her own affairs. She called upon Miss Marple, and the two women sat together in Miss Marple's sitting room, regarding each other with the careful attention of those who had shared knowledge of dark secrets. "I wanted to see you before I departed England permanently," Sylvia said. "I owe you my gratitude for your discretion regarding my intentions in the library. Without that discretion, my reputation would have been utterly destroyed rather than merely damaged." "Your secret is safe," Miss Marple assured her, "though I wonder whether you have fully explored what drove you to such a point of desperation that you would contemplate murdering your own brother." Sylvia was quiet for a long moment. "I believe," she said finally, "that I was driven by the combination of financial desperation and the accumulated weight of my brother's judgment. He had spent years making me feel inferior, morally questionable, fundamentally flawed. When he threatened to expose my personal relationships, he was not merely blackmailing me, he was confirming the judgment I had internalized about myself. And now," Miss Marple asked gently, "now I understand that his judgment was his own failing, not a truth about me. I am a woman who makes unconventional choices, but those choices are not inherently wrong. I have found employment and housing in Paris, and I am building a life that is authentic to who I actually am, rather than who others believe I should be. I have begun to heal." After Sylvia's departure, Miss Marple found herself thinking about the nature of redemption and transformation. Each person who had been touched by James Hartley's death had been changed by it, but the changes varied enormously in character. Some had been broken by the experience. Others had found unexpected pathways to growth and self-understanding. The village of St. Mary Mead, too, had been transformed. The scandal had stripped away the carefully maintained facade of perfect respectability, revealing the complexity and moral ambiguity that existed beneath the surface of every community. The village would gradually reconstruct its facade, such was the human nature. To seek comfort in appearances, but it would never be quite as secure in its self-perception as it had been before. In late March, Miss Marple attended a small gathering at the vicarage, a tea to which a few select village women had been invited. The vicar's wife, Helen, had been imprisoned, and the vicar was learning to live with the knowledge of her betrayal and her crime. It was a heavy burden, one that would likely never be fully lifted. Yet the vicar had begun to move forward. He had established a fund in James Hartley's name to assist young people who had fallen into financial difficulty or moral compromise. It was a modest gesture, but it represented an attempt to transform his grief and shame into something constructive. As Miss Marple left the vicarage that afternoon, walking slowly through the village streets in the pale spring sunshine, she reflected on the strange paradox at the heart of the case. The murder of James Hartley had been a terrible act, committed for understandable if deplorable reasons. Yet that terrible act had also served in unexpected ways as a catalyst for change and growth in those who had survived it. The vicar would likely live out his remaining years in a state of guarded acceptance, his faith tested but not entirely destroyed. Margaret Winters had found purpose in compassion born of self-knowledge. Sylvia Hartley was building an authentic life. Richard Ashford, though damaged, was beginning again in a new place. Victoria, though tragically widowed, would eventually find happiness again. Her character tempered, but not broken by her experiences. And Edmund Gray and Helen Ashford sat in their separate prisons, one serving life for murder, the other serving 15 years for conspiracy. Their punishment was substantial, yet Miss Marple wondered whether it achieved the goal of justice or merely represented society's attempt to contain and control human darkness. That evening, Miss Marple sat in her cottage, her knitting needles clicking in their familiar rhythm, and she allowed herself a moment of quiet satisfaction. She had uncovered the truth. She had ensured that the guilty were identified and punished. She had brought clarity to a case that might otherwise have remained obscured by convenient lies and incomplete confessions. Yet, as she reflected on the full scope of what she had discovered, not merely the mechanics of the murder, but the complex web of motivations, despairs, and moral compromises that had led to it, she understood that uncovering the truth was only the beginning of justice, not its conclusion. True justice would require that the people of St. Mary Mead examined their own capacity for the sins they had condemned in others. It would require that they understand how the pursuit of respectability could corrupt genuine virtue. It would require humility, compassion, and a willingness to acknowledge that the line between innocence and guilt was far more blurred than most people cared to admit. Whether the village would embrace such lessons remained to be seen. But Miss Marple had done what she could. She had observed, she had questioned, she had listened, and she had brought forth truth. The rest was beyond her control, as spring fully arrived in St. Mary Mead, bringing with it renewal and the promise of new growth. Miss Marple set aside her knitting and gazed out at the village she had called home for so many decades. The wedding that had ended in murder would gradually fade into memory, becoming just another story in the long history of human failure and resilience. But the lessons it contained about the complexity of human nature, the ease with which good intentions could be corrupted, the unexpected ways that tragedy could prompt growth, these lessons would linger with her always, informing her continued observations of the village and her place within it. The case was closed. Justice, imperfect as it was, had been served, and Miss Marple, as always, remained vigilant and observant, ready to uncover truth wherever it might hide, understanding that the work of understanding human nature was never truly finished.